I've been a Roman Catholic my whole life, but last year I had the opportunity to attend my very first Divine Liturgy, and it was really good. Like, really, really, really good. It left such a profound impact on me that it changed the way that I think about just about everything.
In my raising our fallen forefather Adam, he has given life to all mankind.
So as a little bit of a background, I grew up in an immigrant family. Both my parents came here from Poland, and they brought me up in the Catholic faith. I was catechized, communed, and went to church at a Polish Catholic church my whole life, which is Western Rite. And that was pretty much my knowledge and my experience of what Catholicism and what Christianity was up until about, when I started discovering that there was other branches of Christianity and started taking a bit more of an interest in church history in general. So I grew up with pretty much only knowing the Western expression of the liturgy. And as of several years back, I was attending a Roman Catholic parish that celebrated the traditional Latin Mass, which is basically the pre-Vatican II Mass celebrated in Latin. So I really didn't have any idea of what the Byzantine Rite was until my friend invited me. One of my good friends from my parish was inviting me all the time to go to Divine Liturgy, and honestly at this time I was already kind of interested in the Byzantine Rite and the Orthodox tradition, as I'm very musical and I'm in the schola in my church. So I'm already in the choir and I'm very acquainted with music. My career is as an audio engineer, so I have a great appreciation for music, and music speaks a lot to me. And so eventually, I think it was January of 2024, don't quote me, but I think that's when it happened. I finally caved in to going to Divine Liturgy for my very first time. So my first Divine Liturgy was at the Assumption of the Blessed Virgin Mary Ukrainian Catholic Church. And this parish is absolutely stunning. Like, it is the nicest church I think I've ever been to in my life. And I've been to Rome. I've been to plenty of places in Europe. I've been to many different cathedrals and churches, and this church really is up there with a lot of them. And it just shows that money is not always the answer to everything. But yeah, now going to the liturgy. So I had this weird preconception that the liturgical music was kind of going to be Greek in nature. I don't know why I thought that. I think it's because the church was called the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church. And at this time I didn't really know anything about the churches or kind of the history about them. So I was really surprised when I kind of heard more Western sounding polyphonic influence in the liturgical music, in the Kievan tradition specifically. So I was expecting like Greek Byzantine chant, which I don't know why I was expecting that, but I heard this Kievan kind of polyphonic tones and I was like, wow, okay, this is still very beautiful. I was absolutely blown away by the music. Like, pretty much right away, even before the liturgy, the choir was just going absolutely crazy. Like, it was so loud, my eardrums were like blasted out of my head, but in such a positive way. The music was very, very intense. Like, very intense, and the acoustics in there are like so resonant. Like, I wasn't used to that in my church. My church has this thick carpet and these pads on the sides of the wall that are supposed to absorb the sound. I have no idea why we did that. So it kind of sounds like you're singing into a sock. But in here, it was like the sound would travel for miles. Like, you would hear the tail of the reverb go on for like 10 seconds. It's so massive and so huge. And then it also helped that the choir was made up of like 20 or 30 people. Like, the sound was just absolutely magnificent and beautiful. This really made me realize the importance of liturgical music and good acoustics in a church. Like, the sensory experience is really important, and we can't kind of toss that out of the picture. And the Easterns really understand that concept. And so the next thing that kind of struck me was the fact that the entire liturgy was conducted in the vernacular language and not Church Slavonic, which I was expecting, because I had heard that there was like a council of people before the Second Vatican Council who were putting a lot of effort in to kind of de-Latinize the Byzantine liturgy by trying to restore the old Church Slavonic into their liturgy. And to be honest, I was kind of a little bit upset by that, because I really love Church Slavonic and I love the way it sounds, and I'm Polish, so I can kind of understand it a little bit. But regardless, I think it was interesting to note that it was in a language that could be understood by people, whether that's Slavonic or Ukrainian. Slavonic is already so similar to Ukrainian or Russian that it can be understood by the congregation to a similar effect as Old English can be understood by English speakers that are contemporary like myself. So this was a little bit different than the Latin Mass, where Latin is the main language, and Latin is extremely different from English. Most people who attend the Latin Mass cannot understand Latin. Maybe a couple of Romanians or some French people here who might understand some of the Romance roots might be able to kind of pick up on it, or some of the Spanish speakers, for example. But in general, you need a missal with a side-by-side translation to kind of get the most out of the Latin liturgy. And this whole experience really made me look into the history of liturgical languages a lot more, and kind of start questioning some of the presuppositions I had about primacy of Latin in the church. And it made me find out about this really cool, I don't know if it's held by the Catholic Church, but there's this trilingual heresy where it's the belief that the only languages that are sacred and should be prayed in are Latin, Hebrew, and Greek. And I honestly have not formed my opinion on this topic, but I'd love to dig deeper into it and maybe do a video on that sometime in the future. So let me know if you'd like to see that. But yeah, regardless, this is something that left an impression on me, and I was like, okay, well now maybe I can appreciate the vernacular, or at least having a liturgical language that's closer to the vernacular rather than something like Latin in the church. The next thing that I noticed, or I guess how could I not notice, was the iconography and exactly how present it was in the liturgy and how important it really is in facilitating prayer. Like the whole liturgy, I really felt like I was focused and I was able to pay attention to what was going on. And even if I kind of started getting sidetracked or a little bit distracted, the icons would kind of pull me back in, because it's like, you look this way, there's icons. You look there, there's icons. There's a huge dome above you with the Pantocrator in just about every Byzantine church, if not every Byzantine church. I'm pretty sure it's kind of like a mandatory thing. But yeah, you literally can't fall asleep. But what's so cool about icons is that every single one of them tells you a unique story regardless of what language you speak. I think if you're an English speaker or a Russian speaker, Ukrainian speaker, or you speak Japanese, we can all look at these icons, and that's why they're so effective in preaching the gospel. It honestly makes me question why in the West we've kind of abandoned the idea of iconography. I mean, I know we have statues and I know we have some iconography in Western churches, but it's really so minimal, and like you go to most parishes and you really struggle to find it. It's kind of nowhere to be found. Or if anything, you might have one small statue and you don't see people reverencing it, you don't see people praying to icons, you don't see people venerating icons or using them in worship in the same way that you do in the East. And I think that's something that we need to bring back. I mean, if you look into the documents towards the end of the Seventh Ecumenical Council, it's quite clear on the importance of having iconography in all places of worship. So I think that's something we ought to really think about bringing back here in the West. So the specific day that I recorded all of these shots was a couple days after Clean Week, and during Clean Week we do the Canon of St. Andrew of Crete, which is 1 billion prostrations, and it's actually a very beautiful canon. The prayers are absolutely beautiful and very penitential in nature, and they really open your heart up to God. And one of my favorite icons was one of St. Andrew of Crete, which was at the front of the church. And another one of my favorite icons was, of course, the Pantocrator, which is on the dome. When you look up, you're kind of reminded that God is the creator of everything. He's the creator of the universe. He's the creator of all matter, and all matter is sanctified by him and his presence entering into the world, and his decision to take on humanity onto himself voluntarily and suffer on the cross. Like many of the saints have echoed, all matter has become sanctified once Christ became incarnate. And what better way to illustrate that than having a church that's completely decked out wall to wall with iconography in the gospel? I just don't think there's a better way to express that. Another thing I really appreciated was the iconostasis. So the iconostasis is actually something that's not necessarily really unique to the East, but it's something that even Anglicans have preserved, and it was something very popular before the Council of Trent. And essentially this goes back to Old Testament days where inside of synagogues you had the veil, or the temple veil, right? The curtain that kind of blocked out the laity from being able to enter the Holy of Holies, as this area was reserved for the tabernacle and for the sacred. And I love that that has permeated and kind of not gone away with the East, because I think it illustrates a really important picture to us of what's really happening. And there's always a step. So you have the iconostasis, and behind that you have the sanctuary with the tabernacle, and all of the sanctuary is kind of lifted up on one step. And the iconostasis is not there to divide us from God, but it's kind of see-through, just enough to kind of see what's going on. But then you have the royal doors which open, and that signifies God opening up his covenant to us, right? To us Gentiles and to us who are so undeserving of his love. And it just illustrates this very beautiful picture to our senses, which I think is kind of lost in the West. And that could partially be a reason for a decrease in reverence for the true presence of Christ in the Eucharist. And for example, at the Latin Mass, we have something called altar rails, which is like these little railings that kind of go around. And I think that's kind of like a dumbed down version of the iconostasis. Like over time in the West, the iconostasis just became this little kneeler barrier between us and the sanctuary. But I think we should kind of raise those up, put some icons on them, bring back some of that early church flavor into our liturgies again, because I think it would do us a lot of benefit. And they also just look really cool. Another thing that I noticed that was quite quite different about the church was that in the prayer, it was quite a lot more focused on the resurrection. So in the West, there's a tendency to focus on the crucifixion. And I know this is going to sound super reductionistic, but I think we can all kind of agree that there's a bit of a theological difference in terms of the liturgies. And I'm not saying one is better than the other, but there's a difference. So in the East, there's a greater emphasis, I feel like, on the resurrection. Like even during Lent, in the West, we completely cut out the word Alleluia liturgically. Like we're not allowed to say it pretty much. But in the East, they actually double down on it and they say Alleluia like 10 times more. So I had to say that was kind of a breath of fresh air for me, as I really think those prayers spoke deeply to my heart and kind of helped me have an inner conversion. And I really left the liturgy meditating on a lot of those prayers and the spirit of what they were saying. And they really helped me in my spiritual life. I have to say I needed that balance of kind of the resurrection to the crucifixion. I needed to hear the full picture. And that's another reason why the West and the East need each other so badly. And I have to say, just really overall, my experience with the Divine Liturgy was very holistic. I think that's like the best word that I can find to kind of describe the theology and the spirituality of the East that I've experienced, is it's been very holistic. And even to my senses, this has been illustrated when I saw during a Divine Liturgy confessions being heard in public. And I was like, wow, this is something that I heard happened only in the early church, but I saw public confessions during liturgy. And obviously not public, like the person wasn't confessing to us in the congregation, but they would confess to a priest in front of everybody while the Divine Liturgy was happening. And you could see the hieromonk who was hearing everybody's confessions absolve them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit. And it was just so touching and so beautiful. That happening during the Divine Liturgy as well was such a testament to the gospel and what the gospel really is, that God is always approachable, even during the ceremony, even during the Mass. And when you have a contrite heart, there's no wrong time to approach God, to repent of your sins and to change your way of life. It can be in the middle of the night, it can be in the middle of the liturgy. But it wasn't just that, it was really everything. Even the small details like the jingles on the incenser as the incense filled the air. The jingles just remind us of holiness, right? Like whenever we hear the Sanctus bell in Mass, we know that something very special is going on. But to have like 20 of them on the incenser and kind of reminding us that our prayers are ascending to God, I found that the East was just so detail oriented. They really loved the small things. And a lot of these small gestures kind of added up into this one big, beautiful experience. And I kind of compare it as if you take a photo or a video of something and then you go into the settings and you just crank the saturation all the way up and the colors are just vibrant and vivid. That's kind of what it's like to be at the Divine Liturgy when you've never experienced it before. And I think all of this really lends itself to this active participation, right? We always hear in the West that the church calls for active participation. But you got to wonder, why do we struggle with that in the West, right? Well, if you go to our liturgies in the West, some of them, as beautiful as they are, they can sometimes feel a little bit dry when it comes to some of these more small nuanced things like the jingles on the censer, the iconography, the iconostasis, these sort of small but very tangible things that kind of add up to our personal experience and our personal encounter with God. And I feel like if we want to see better active participation in the West, we have to kind of increase these things in our liturgies. Because sometimes at the Latin Mass, and I know I'm going to get so much hate for saying this, but let's be real, you go to a low Mass. I mean, my first experience at a traditional Latin Mass, which I'll do a whole nother video on, I wasn't even sure when the priest was actually starting the liturgy. Like, it was so quiet, and the priest got up there, I'm like, okay, have we started yet? So I wasn't even sure what was really going on. And that's beautiful in its own way. I think that serenity and that silence can really add to prayer in its own unique way. But if it pervades the whole liturgy, I think that there's a problem with active participation. You know, when you have laity praying the rosary or doing private devotions in the back while Mass is going on, I kind of see that as a bit of a problem, because the liturgy should be something that we all communally participate in. But that's a hot topic for another video. So in the end, this experience really made me reflect on the relationship between the West and the East. I was humbled really, really hard. I did not expect to get what I was going to get. I've seen videos and pictures of it online before, of the Divine Liturgy, but being there in person was totally different. To all the priests and all the people online saying that you cannot be a Catholic just online, it's so true. You have to get out there and go to a liturgy and receive his body and blood into yourself and truly experience him physically, because Christ not only calls us to an intellectual relationship, but a physical relationship. And so in the end, this experience really made me appreciate the East and kind of reconsider my views on the Orthodox and the Eastern Catholic churches and what they have to give in value to the universal church and why we need them so badly. And one thing I've noticed is how much each lung of the church really complements the other. The West really complements the East and vice versa. I think we really fill in each other's gaps, and we have so much to offer to each other in terms of theology and spirituality. And this is a huge reason why I really wanted to start this channel, was because I don't believe that we as Roman Catholics should just be so prideful to kind of think that we have everything it takes and we don't need to see reunion. It's fine that we're divided. We have the fullness of the faith. But in practice, I think we really do need to focus on unity, and we really do need to sit down and slow down and say, hey, okay, there's a lot to appreciate about the Eastern traditions, and there's a lot that they have to offer us that maybe we didn't really see. And how many of these practices and rituals that were done by the early church are still preserved in the East, and not only preserved, but they still retain their meaning. You know, sometimes we can preserve traditions and they lose their meaning. And I think that's one thing that I was really impressed by with the East, was the amount of these old ancient practices, but it seems like the people really understood what they meant and they didn't lose their practicality. And so if you're a Western Roman Catholic, I would highly recommend you to go and experience the Divine Liturgy for yourself. You might just find something of value there that you didn't know even existed within the Catholic tradition. For me personally, I don't even know if I would have this channel right now if I didn't attend my first Divine Liturgy. I think it woke me up to the reality of the East and of the fullness of the universal church so much that it made me really want to create content surrounding it, because I think it's a topic that we need to discuss a little bit more frequently than we do. So for those of you who are already familiar with the Divine Liturgy, I'd love to hear how it's impacted your walk with Christ in the comments below. Also, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share with a friend who's also interested in this type of content. Your support dramatically impacts this channel's ability to carry out its mission, and it is greatly, greatly appreciated. And until next time, God bless.